Calvin Reeves was 42 years old, and when his wife asked why they weren't further ahead in life, he looked her in the eye and said, "I'm broke on paper, Adrian. What you see is what we've got." It was the most calculated thing he had ever said to her, because Calvin Reeves was not broke. He owned 11 properties across 3 states, $2.1 million in equity, all buried inside an LLC his grandmother's attorney helped him build from the ground up, invisible to everyone, including his wife. Adrienne had already made her decision. She had been seeing a mortgage broker named Troy for 14 months, had quietly drained $34,000 from their shared account, and had consulted a divorce attorney 8 months before she ever said the word separation out loud. She left believing she had researched everything: his salary, their assets, his limits. She had found a luxury apartment Troy called a private find, floor-to-ceiling windows. Best managed building in Atlanta, her new neighbors would tell her. What Adrienne did not know, could not have known, was that the building belonged to her husband. Calvin had approved her lease application himself, and he had done it for a reason she would not understand until it was far too late. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Through the morning traffic of Atlanta's historic Fourth Ward, Calvin Reeves guided his Camry with the same steady patience he applied to everything in his life. The 7-year-old car hummed softly, well-maintained like everything else he owned. He passed the red brick buildings that lined the street, their ground-floor businesses already coming alive with the day's first customers. These weren't just any buildings he was passing. They were his, all part of Reeves Capital Holdings, LLC. But you wouldn't know it by looking at him. Calvin preferred it that way. The coffee shop's morning crowd spilled onto the sidewalk. The boutique next door was setting up a new window display. His property manager, Patricia, had picked good tenants, stable businesses that added value to the neighborhood. Calvin noticed the fresh paint on one of the door frames, maintenance staying on top of things, just as he'd specified. He drove past without slowing down, the way a gardener might glance at thriving plants without needing to stop and fuss. Everything was growing exactly as it should. At the stoplight, Calvin checked his watch. A modest Seiko, reliable and understated. He had time before he needed to be at the engineering firm where he worked. The job paid well enough, but it was almost decorative compared to what his real estate portfolio brought in. Not that anyone knew that part. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. "Baby, don't ever let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, especially when your right hand is stacking." She'd lost her home to predatory lending back in the day. The lesson stuck. When Calvin bought his first property at 29, he'd done it through an LLC, with her old real estate attorney drawing up the paperwork. Now, 13 years later, that decision had grown into something substantial. 11 residential and mixed-use properties across Atlanta, 2 more in Birmingham, and 1 in Memphis. Current equity, just over $2.1 million. The light turned green, and Calvin continued his morning drive, thinking about Adrienne. 11 years of marriage, and the last 4 had shown a change in her he couldn't ignore. Just yesterday, she'd made another comment about Marcus Chen at her hospital. How he'd just bought a Tesla. How he was really going places. The contempt in her voice when she looked at Calvin's Camry had been subtle, but clear. He remembered when they'd first met, how she'd loved his stability, his reliability. Now those same qualities seemed to irritate her. She'd grown increasingly focused on appearance, on status, on what other people were doing and buying and achieving. The modest house they shared in the suburbs had become a source of constant comparison to her co-workers' homes. Calvin checked his rearview mirror, changed lanes smoothly. He thought about the way Adrienne had started keeping her phone face down, the way she tilted the screen away when texting. how she'd stopped laughing at his jokes months ago. Not recently, but gradually, like a plant slowly turning away from the sun. He noticed everything. He always had. But Calvin processed in silence, gathered information like a patient collector, turning each piece over in his mind before filing it away. It wasn't coldness. There was a warmth to him that his close friends and family knew well. It was simply his way. Observe, consider, wait. The morning sun caught the building's windows as he made the final turn toward home. He'd left early to check on a minor maintenance issue at one of his properties, and now he was returning to grab the laptop he'd deliberately left behind, giving himself a reason to come back, to observe. Pulling into the driveway of their modest two-story home, Calvin heard Adrienne's laughter through the open kitchen window. It was different from her usual laugh, lighter, more genuine than he'd heard in months. The sound cut off abruptly as his car door clicked shut. Inside, he found her at the kitchen island, phone in hand, her face composed into what he recognized as her work expression. Professional, distant. "Forgot my laptop," he said, voice even. "Oh," Adrienne replied, her phone now face down on the counter. "I thought you'd left for the day." Calvin noticed the slight adjustment of her posture, the way her fingers curled protectively around the edge of her phone. He noticed, and he filed it away with all the other things he'd been noticing. He picked up his laptop from the dining room table. "Have a good day," he said. Adrienne's response was distracted, already looking back at her phone. "You too." Calvin walked out, got back into his Camry, and headed to work. He didn't slam the door. He didn't speed away. He drove exactly as he always did. Steady, measured, deliberate. The same way he did everything else. 3 weeks after that morning drive, Calvin sat at the kitchen table, morning sun streaming through the windows. Adrienne rushed around gathering her things for work, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors. "Can you print the car insurance documents?" she called from the hallway. "They're on my laptop. I need them for the renewal today." "Sure," Calvin replied, reaching for her silver laptop on the counter. "Thanks. I'm running late." The front door closed behind her, leaving Calvin alone with the quiet hum of the house. He opened the laptop, familiar with where she kept documents. They'd shared passwords for years, a transparency that now felt hollow. The browser was already open, multiple tabs lined across the top. He was about to click over to their insurance provider's website when a tab caught his eye, a long message thread. Calvin's hand stilled on the touchpad. The name, Troy Beaumont, sat at the top of the chat window. Something in his chest tightened, but his breathing remained steady. He scrolled up, then up again, watching dates roll backward through time. 14 months. The messages went back 14 months. "Good morning, beautiful." From Troy. "Missing you already." From Adrienne. "Last night was perfect." From Troy. "When can I see you again?" From Adrienne. Calvin read with the same careful attention he gave to contract reviews, taking in every detail, every timestamp. The messages were comfortable, practiced, the easy back and forth of people who had long since stopped worrying about being caught. They discussed meetings at hotels, shared jokes about mutual friends, planned future encounters with the casual confidence of those who believed they were untouchable. But it was a message from 3 weeks ago that made Calvin's fingers go still on the keyboard. Adrienne had written, "He doesn't own anything. His check is good, but he's basically broke on paper. I've been doing my research. When I leave clean." Calvin read those lines 4 times, letting each word settle into place like sediment in still water. The affair itself was a wound, yes, but this was something colder. This was calculation. This was strategy. He scrolled further, finding more evidence of her preparation. She'd been cataloging their joint accounts, documenting his visible assets, even noting the Camry's blue book value. There were mentions of consultations with a divorce attorney, discussions about timing, about leverage. about the clean break she believed she could execute. With the same deliberate movements he used for everything else, Calvin closed the message thread. He opened the insurance website, found their policy documents, and sent them to the printer. The pages emerged with a soft whir: proof of coverage, liability limits, all the ordinary details of a shared life that was no longer shared. He placed the printed documents on the counter where Adrienne would find them when she got home. Then he went to work, drove the same route, parked in the same spot, greeted the same colleagues. At lunch, sitting in his car in the parking deck, Calvin pulled out his phone. He called Dion, the only person who knew about Reeves Capital Holdings, the only one who understood what Calvin had built in silence. "She's making moves," Calvin said when Dion answered. A pause on the other end. Dion knew his brother, knew the weight those 3 words carried. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing yet." Calvin's voice was steady. "Just sit still." That evening, Calvin cooked dinner. Chicken stir-fry, rice, green beans. When Adrienne came home, he watched her move through their kitchen with new eyes. She smiled at the right moments, asked about his day with practiced interest, but he saw it all now. The slight distance in her eyes, the way she kept checking her phone, the mechanical nature of her domestic performance. She'd already left. Her body was just catching up to where her mind had gone months ago. They ate dinner, and Calvin asked about her day, about the insurance renewal, about the patients at her hospital. He watched her answer each question with smooth efficiency, like an actress who had mastered her lines through long rehearsal. Later, lying in bed, Calvin didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, listening to Adrienne's even breathing beside him, a woman who thought she was sharing a bed with a man who owned nothing but a reliable paycheck and a 7-year-old Camry. In the darkness, he began to think, slowly and methodically, about load-bearing walls and structural integrity, about foundations and what happens when you remove them, piece by piece. 10 days after finding the messages, Calvin sat on their living room couch, watching Adrienne pace in measured steps. She'd chosen a Sunday afternoon for this conversation, deliberately timed when they were both free. She wore a cream blouse and dark slacks, dressed for a performance she'd clearly rehearsed. "I need to talk to you about something important," she began, her voice steady and practiced. She stopped pacing and sat in the armchair across from him, perched on the edge like someone preparing to leave a meeting. Calvin watched her, his face neutral, hands relaxed on his knees. He said nothing, waiting. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Adrienne continued, "about my life, about where I'm going, about us." She paused, studying his face for reaction. Finding none, she pressed on. "I feel like I've grown in a different direction. The person I am now. I need space to figure out who that is." The sunlight through the window caught the edge of her wedding ring. Calvin noticed she was still wearing it. "For now. I think we should separate," she said finally. "I believe it would be healthier for both of us." Calvin let the words settle in the room. He could see the careful construction of her speech. No mention of Troy. No hint of the 14 months of messages. No acknowledgement of the research she'd done into their finances. Just a clean, practiced narrative about growth and change. "Okay," he said. Adrienne blinked. She'd prepared for anger, for questions, for emotional resistance. The simple acceptance seemed to throw her off balance for a moment. But then her expression smoothed over, and Calvin watched her mentally file his response as further evidence of what she'd already decided. Emotional unavailability, lack of passion, all the reasons she'd listed to Troy in their messages. "I found an apartment," she said, regaining her footing. "I think it's best if I move out within the next couple of weeks." Calvin nodded. "Do you need help moving?" Another blink. "No, I've arranged everything." Within 2 weeks, Adrienne had signed a lease on a luxury apartment in a newly renovated mixed-use building on Peachtree Flat. Troy had called it a find, a connection through a buddy at the management company, a unit that wasn't even publicly listed yet. 4 floors of sleek architecture, modern finishes, and a trendy coffee shop on the ground floor. The day she moved in, Adrienne called her sister. She walked through the space, phone pressed to her ear, running her hand along the quartz countertops. "Girl, you wouldn't believe this place," she said, voice bright with triumph. "Floor-to-ceiling windows, stainless everything, and the location. Perfect." She paused by the window, looking down at the street below. Meanwhile, Calvin is somewhere in that little house still driving that Camry. I'm standing here looking at the city skyline. 3 weeks later, Troy moved in. They didn't bother being discreet about it. Why should they? The lease was in Adrienne's name, the building management was professional and distant, and Calvin was, in their minds, completely removed from this new chapter of their lives. What they didn't know, couldn't know, was that 478 Peachtree Flat was Property 7 of 11 in the Reeves Capital Holdings LLC portfolio. Calvin had purchased it 4 years ago when it was a struggling commercial property, poured 18 months and significant capital into renovation, and transformed it into exactly the kind of upscale mixed-use building his wife had just chosen as her escape. The text from Patricia Okafor came on a Tuesday morning. New tenant inquiry for Unit 3B. Last name Whitfield Reeves. Want me to decline? Calvin sat in his office, staring at the message. Through the window behind him, he could see the edge of another property he owned. Property 4, a rehabilitated warehouse now housing boutique offices. He thought about load-bearing walls again, about foundations, about the quiet way buildings hold their secrets. He typed back, "Approve it." That evening, Adrienne stood at her new window, phone pressed to her ear again, voice warm with satisfaction as she spoke to her sister. "I can't believe I waited so long," she said, watching the sunset paint the city gold. "Calvin's probably sitting in that little house right now, in his practical little life. And here I am, living exactly how I deserve to live." She laughed, the sound carrying through the carefully engineered space of Unit 3B. 2 floors below, the building's systems hummed quietly. HVAC, security, all the invisible infrastructure that made luxury possible. All of it owned, maintained, and monitored by the husband she thought she'd left behind. The morning sun cast long shadows across Atlanta's business district as Calvin guided his Camry into a visitor spot outside Patricia Okafor's law office. The building was deliberately unremarkable, a mid-rise commercial space that housed various professional services. Nothing connected it to Reeves Capital Holdings LLC or any of Calvin's properties. He checked his watch. 8:15 a.m. Patricia had agreed to meet him before her regular appointments. That was her way. Efficient, direct, no wasted motion. The elevator carried him to the 7th floor. Patricia's office occupied a corner suite, its reception area neat and minimalist. The receptionist, recognizing him, buzzed him straight through. Patricia stood when he entered, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. She was dressed in a charcoal suit, her hair pulled back severely, reading glasses perched on her nose. 6 years of working together had taught Calvin to appreciate her complete lack of unnecessary conversation. "Coffee?" she asked, already pouring from a carafe on her credenza. "Thank you," Calvin said, settling into the chair. He accepted the cup, noting how the morning light made the steam visible. Patricia returned to her seat, opened a leather portfolio, and waited. She knew Calvin would speak when he was ready. "Adrienne moved into Unit 3B at Peachtree Flat yesterday," he began. "She doesn't know I own it. She's separating from me, filing for divorce." He paused, sipped his coffee. "She's been having an affair with a mortgage broker named Troy Beaumont. 14 months, at least?" Patricia made a single note in her portfolio. Her expression didn't change. "The lease application you sent me, I approved it because I want them there. For now." Calvin set his cup down. "I've retained Celeste Hargrove for the divorce. She specializes in high-asset cases." Patricia nodded once. "I know Celeste. She's thorough. She's already started documenting the LLC holdings. All 11 properties, acquisition dates, separate asset status. She'll need coordination from your office. You'll have it. Patricia adjusted her glasses. The tenant situation? You want them in place? Yes. And the building? She looked at him directly. What do you want the building to do for you in this situation? Calvin appreciated the precision of her question. Right now? Nothing. I want the building to be a building. I want them to pay rent on time and live their life. The building becomes useful later. Patricia made another note. I'll coordinate with Celeste's office on the asset documentation. Full portfolio review, clear timeline on pre-marital acquisition, separate property status. She paused. The new tenants will receive standard treatment. No special attention, no early flags. Exactly. His phone buzzed. Celeste Hargrove's office. Excuse me, he said, standing. I need to take this. Patricia nodded, already turning to her computer. In the hallway, Calvin answered. Celeste's voice was clipped, professional. We found something in the preliminary asset review. Your wife opened a joint savings account with Troy Beaumont at Greater Atlanta Credit Union 22 months ago. She's been making regular transfers from your shared household account. Calvin felt his chest tighten. How much? Small amounts. 300 here, 500 there. Never enough to trigger attention in any given month. Celeste paused. Total balance, as of yesterday, $34,000. Calvin walked to the elevator, rode it down to the parking deck. He sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, letting the numbers settle in his mind. 34,000. Not just emotional betrayal, systematic financial extraction. 22 months of small decisions, each one a choice to take what wasn't hers. He breathed slowly, deliberately. The wheel was solid under his hands. He thought about his grandmother, about what she'd said about money and trust, and the importance of keeping things separate. He thought about Adrienne standing in that apartment, looking down at the city, thinking she'd won something. He dialed Celeste back. Add it, he said when she answered. Document everything. Already started, she replied. We'll need bank records, transfer histories. You'll have them by end of day. He drove to his next job site, a commercial renovation project he was consulting on. The blueprints sat on his passenger seat. Someone else's vision rolled up in white paper. He parked in the construction lot and sat for a moment, looking at those plans. He thought about what he'd built over 13 years. Not just properties, but a structure of protection around everything he valued. He thought about Adrienne in Unit 3B, living in a building she thought represented her escape, not knowing she was standing in the middle of what he'd created in silence. Calvin picked up the blueprints. He got out of his car. He had a job to do. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Unit 3B, and Troy Beaumont stood in its warmth, coffee cup in hand, admiring the view of Atlanta's skyline. He'd been living here for 2 weeks now, and the satisfaction hadn't worn off. The furniture arrangement still wasn't quite right. He'd spent yesterday moving the sectional sofa for the 3rd time, but that was part of the fun, making the space his own. He walked to the kitchen, running his hand along the quartz countertop. The finishes in this place were exactly what he would have chosen himself. Whoever renovated the building had good taste, he thought. Professional taste. The kind of taste that came with understanding both quality and market value. His phone buzzed. A text from his colleague Mark. How's the new place? Troy smiled, typing back. Perfect. You should come by for drinks this weekend. Views are insane. He'd been telling everyone about the apartment. Not bragging exactly. Troy considered himself too sophisticated for that, but definitely letting people know he'd moved up. At the office yesterday, he'd casually mentioned to his team that he'd found a nice spot in that new development on Peachtree Flat. The knowing nods had been satisfying. Everyone understood what that meant. Adrienne emerged from the bedroom, dressed for work in a tailored blazer and pencil skirt. She looked expensive, Troy thought. She belonged in a place like this. I'm thinking about having some people over Saturday, he said, pouring her coffee. Show off the place a little. Adrienne smiled, accepting the cup. Already? We barely have furniture. That's the point. We can talk about what we're planning to do with the space. Maybe get some ideas. He gestured to the empty corner by the windows. I'm thinking a baby grand would look perfect there. A piano? Adrienne raised an eyebrow. You don't play. It's about the aesthetic, Troy explained. Plus, good investment piece. Like this building. Somebody really thought through the details here. He walked to the window again, professional instincts kicking in. The whole setup is smart. LLC ownership structure, professional management company handling operations, reduces liability, optimizes tax position. Whoever's behind it knows what they're doing. Adrienne shrugged, checking her phone. It's some management company. Reeves Capital something. I never really looked into it. Smart way to run it. Troy nodded, impressed by the invisible owner. Maybe we should look at something similar when this lease is up. There's a new development breaking ground in Buckhead. Pre-construction pricing could be interesting. He was already thinking ahead. This apartment was perfect for now, but Troy Beaumont had always understood the importance of momentum. You didn't stay still in life. You kept moving up, finding the next opportunity, the next upgrade. That evening, they ordered Thai food and ate at the breakfast bar, looking out at the city lights. Troy told Adrienne about his day, a new client with excellent financials, a potential partnership opportunity with a developer. He was good at his job, good at reading situations and people, good at seeing where advantage lived in any given scenario. Calvin never understood any of this, Adrienne said, pushing her pad thai around her plate. He was always so content. With that little house, that old car. Troy smiled, reaching for his wine glass. Some people just lack vision. They can't see past what's right in front of them. He took a satisfied sip. Their loss. Later, lying in bed, Troy listened to the quiet hum of the building's excellent HVAC system. Everything here worked perfectly. The water pressure, the lighting, the soundproofing, professional-grade comfort. He thought about Calvin, still driving that Camry, still living in that modest suburb. The man hadn't even fought when Adrienne left, just said, okay, and let her go. Troy drifted off to sleep, comfortable in the knowledge that he'd read the situation correctly. He was where he belonged, in an apartment that reflected his understanding of value, with a woman who appreciated that understanding. In the hallway outside Unit 3B, soft footsteps passed, the night maintenance crew doing their rounds. A piece of paper slipped under the door, a standard notification about upcoming filter changes and routine maintenance checks, printed on Reeves Capital Holdings, LLC letterhead. The paper settled on the floor, waiting for morning. The maintenance notification fluttered on the hardwood floor when Adrienne opened the door the next morning. She picked it up, glancing at the letterhead, Reeves Capital Holdings, LLC, and skimmed the standard text about filter changes and routine checks. She placed it on the kitchen counter next to Troy's coffee mug, already forgotten as she gathered her things for work. Across town, in a corner office overlooking Peachtree Street, Celeste Hargrove reviewed the divorce filing one final time before submission. The paperwork was precise, as everything in her office was precise. She had built her reputation on attention to detail, and this filing was no different. She made a single notation in the margin, then signed where indicated. Her assistant would handle the actual filing. By mid-afternoon, Adrienne's attorney, Sarah Maxwell, received the notification. She reviewed the preliminary asset disclosure with practiced efficiency. The suburban house, 2 cars, including that old Camry, the shared household account. Standard middle-class division territory. She made a few notes about negotiation points and sent Adrienne a brief email. Nothing unexpected. We'll discuss strategy next week. Maxwell had handled hundreds of divorces like this. She saw no reason this one would be different. She added it to her stack of active cases and moved on to other matters. Calvin pulled into Dion's driveway just after 6. His brother's house sat on a quiet street in Grant Park. A craftsman with good bones and better landscaping. Dion answered the door before Calvin could knock. He'd been watching through the front window. "Come on," Dion said, leading the way to the kitchen. "Coffee's fresh." Calvin sat at the kitchen island while Dion poured 2 cups. The kitchen was warm, lived in. Pictures of Dion's kids covered the refrigerator. The coffee maker hummed quietly. "Talk to me," Dion said, sliding a mug across the counter. Calvin wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic. For a long moment, he just sat there, looking into the dark liquid. When he finally spoke, his voice was different than Dion had ever heard it. Not broken, but worn at the edges. "Remember that trip to Savannah?" Calvin asked. "3rd year of marriage. We took that weekend, stayed in that bed and breakfast Adrian found. Place had those ridiculous flowered curtains." Dion nodded, letting his brother talk. "She laughed at everything that weekend," Calvin continued. "Real laugh, not the one she does now at work functions. We walked the whole city. She kept taking pictures of doors, said she wanted to remember the colors." He took a slow sip of coffee. "That was the last good year, I think. Maybe part of the next one. Then something changed. Or maybe it was always changing, and I just didn't want to see it." "When did you know?" Dion asked quietly. "That it was over? Or that she was leaving? That she wasn't who you married anymore?" Calvin set his cup down carefully. 3 years ago, Christmas dinner at her parents'. She was telling some story about work, about some problem she'd solved. Good story. But the way she told it, she kept looking at her father, not me, like she was auditioning for something, like I wasn't even in the room. Dion let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said what needed saying. "You were faithful to a woman who had already left. That's not weakness. That's just where you were." He met his brother's eyes. "But you're not there anymore." Calvin looked up. "No, I'm not." Dion reached for a folder on the counter. "Then you need to see this. Found it through work. Banking network flagged it last week." He slid the folder across. Calvin opened it, read slowly. The Georgia Department of Banking and Finance complaint was detailed. Former client Michael Sanderson alleging Troy Beaumont had steered him into a predatory mortgage product in exchange for a kickback from Regional First Lending. Dates, amounts, copies of emails, 6 months old, still under investigation. "Troy doesn't know anyone knows," Dion said quietly. "Definitely doesn't know it's in your hands." Calvin closed the folder. He pulled out his phone and dialed Celeste's number. When she answered, he said 3 words, "Add this too." He finished his coffee, thanked his brother, and walked to his car. The sun was setting as he drove, painting Atlanta's skyline in deep orange. He passed his 4th Ward properties, the windows catching the last light. He didn't slow down. He kept driving, steady, forward, toward home. Patricia Okafor sat at her desk early on a Tuesday morning, reviewing the standard lease renewal package for Unit 3B at Peachtree Flat. Everything was in order. The 5% adjustment clearly outlined in Section 4.2 of the original lease, the updated utility rates, the standard property maintenance terms. She added the portfolio audit addendum with the same careful attention she gave every document that crossed her desk. The addendum was simple, direct. As part of a scheduled portfolio review, Reeves Capital Holdings, LLC, has identified occupancy discrepancies in multiple units. Unit 3B's original lease indicates single occupancy. Management has documented consistent dual occupancy since March 15th. Per lease terms, Section 8.1, all full-time residents must complete background screening and co-tenant documentation within 30 days of notification. Non-compliance may result in lease review. She sealed the envelope personally, something she rarely did. But this wasn't a rare situation. This was Calvin's building, Calvin's plan, and precision mattered. The envelope arrived the next morning. Adrienne collected it from the mailbox, brought it upstairs to where Troy was making breakfast. He'd started cooking more since moving in, claiming the kitchen had better light than his old place. He glanced at the envelope as she opened it. Renewal already? He flipped an omelet with practiced ease. Thought we had another month. They're thorough, Adrienne said, scanning the documents. She paused at the addendum. Oh, they noticed you're living here? Troy set 2 plates on the counter. Of course they did. Professional outfit like this? They track everything. He took the papers, reading with the quick efficiency of someone who processed real estate documents daily. Standard stuff. 5% bump. That's actually pretty reasonable in this market. Background check for me, co-tenant agreement. He shrugged. Want me to handle it? Would you? I've got that budget meeting this morning. Troy nodded, already pulling up the background check service he used for mortgage clients on his phone. I'll take care of it today. No red flags on my end. Credit's solid. No criminal record. Employment history's clean. He didn't mention the banking complaint. It wasn't public yet. And anyway, that was just bureaucratic nonsense that would blow over. Across town, in Celeste Hargrove's office, a different set of papers was being prepared. The formal introduction of Reeves Capital Holdings LLC into the divorce proceedings was 48 pages of meticulous documentation: property deeds, purchase dates, renovation costs, current valuations, management contracts. Everything arranged to tell a clear story. These were premarital assets, separately maintained, professionally managed. Celeste had seen opposing counsel deflate before. She'd built her practice on moments like this, but there was something particularly satisfying about this one. The clean lines of it, the perfect documentation, the way Calvin had built something so solid while someone slept beside him thinking he was standing still. Sarah Maxwell's request for LLC documentation arrived by email at 2:15 p.m. Celeste replied at 2:17 p.m. with 11 separate PDFs, each labeled clearly, each containing exactly what had been asked for. No games, no delays. Just facts, arranged in order, waiting to be read. At 4 o'clock, Calvin walked into Patricia's office building. The security guard nodded. He'd been coming here long enough to be recognized. The elevator carried him to the 8th floor, where Patricia's assistant showed him straight to the conference room. Patricia and Celeste were already there. Documents spread across the polished wood table in precise sections. Property records, bank statements, the fraud complaint against Troy, the records of Adrienne's diverted funds. Everything they had built, everything they had found, everything that was about to matter. Calvin took the seat at the head of the table. He looked at the spread of paper, his life's work laid out in black and white, ready to step into the light. He thought about Adrienne in his building, Troy running his background check, Sarah Maxwell about to open those PDFs. He looked at Patricia, who had helped him build it, at Celeste, who would help him protect it. They waited for his word, these competent women who understood exactly what patience could build. Okay, Calvin said, touching the edge of the nearest document. We're ready. In her office across town, Sarah Maxwell opened the first PDF, then the second. By the third, she was sitting forward in her chair, making notes in the margins. By the 6th, she had cleared her evening schedule. By the 8th, she was reaching for her phone. She looked at the clock, 7:45 p.m. Late, but this couldn't wait. She pulled up Adrienne's number and pressed dial, watching the Atlanta skyline darken outside her window while the phone rang. Adrienne barely slept after her attorney's call. Sarah Maxwell's voice had been careful, measured, the tone lawyers use when delivering news that changes everything. She'd asked Adrienne to come to the office first thing in the morning, before the deposition. There are things we need to discuss, she'd said. Things that affect our strategy significantly. Now, at 8:45 a.m., Adrian sat in the beige conference room of Hargrove and Associates, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee she hadn't tasted. Sarah Maxwell sat beside her, spreading documents across their side of the table with the precise movements of someone trying to maintain professional composure. The door opened. Celeste Hargrove entered first, tall, elegant, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Adrian's monthly rent. Calvin followed, wearing the same kind of unremarkable business casual outfit he always wore to work. He took his seat across the table without ceremony. "Good morning," Celeste said, opening her briefcase. "Before we begin formal negotiations regarding the dissolution of marriage between Calvin and Adrian Reeves, I'd like to introduce some relevant documentation into the record." She removed a thick folder and began laying out papers with practiced efficiency. First, the complete documentation of Reeves Capital Holdings LLC, formed 13 years ago, predating the marriage by 2 years. The LLC currently holds 11 properties across 3 states, 9 in Atlanta, 2 in Birmingham, 1 in Memphis. Adrian watched Sarah Maxwell's shoulders tighten slightly. "Current total equity position," Celeste continued, "approximately $2.1 million, with all acquisition dates, renovation costs, and income streams fully documented. You'll note that 9 of the 11 properties were purchased before the marriage, with all funds traced to separate accounts maintained exclusively by Mr. Reeves." Sarah Maxwell began flipping through the papers, her manicured nails moving faster with each page. Adrian stared at Calvin, who sat quietly, hands folded on the table. "Additionally," Celeste said, producing another folder, "we have documentation of funds diverted from the marital household account over a period of 22 months, totaling $34,000. These funds were transferred to a joint savings account at Greater Georgia Credit Union, held by Adrian Reeves and Troy Beaumont." The coffee cup trembled slightly in Adrian's hands. She set it down. Sarah Maxwell cleared her throat. "May we have a moment?" "Of course," Celeste said smoothly. Sarah led Adrian to a small conference room down the hall. She closed the door and turned to face her client. "Adrian, this changes everything. The LLC assets are bulletproof, separately held, predating the marriage, professionally managed. And the diverted funds," she shook her head. "We need to adjust our position immediately." "He can't just hide assets like this," Adrienne said, but her voice lacked conviction. "He didn't hide them. They were properly registered, properly managed, properly documented. We just didn't know to look because—" Sarah hesitated. "Because we made assumptions." They returned to the main conference room. Calvin hadn't moved. He sat exactly as he had before, patient, unruffled. "Ms. Hargrove," Sarah said, "we'd like to discuss settlement parameters." The next hour was a methodical dismantling of everything Adrian had expected from this divorce. The house she'd thought modest would be sold, with proceeds split equally. The marital accounts would be divided, minus the $34,000 she'd diverted. The LLC properties, the real wealth, the thing Calvin had built in silence, would remain entirely his. When the framework was settled, when Sarah had advised Adrian this was the best outcome they could hope for, Adrian finally spoke directly to Calvin. "You lied to me," she said, her voice tight with something between anger and disbelief. Calvin looked at her with the same steady gaze she'd misread for so many years. "I didn't lie to you," he said quietly. "I just didn't tell you everything." Which is something we apparently had in common. The deposition concluded at 11:45 a.m. Celeste gathered her document. Sarah Maxwell gathered what remained of her strategy. Calvin stood, buttoned his jacket, and left without another word. Adrian walked to her car alone. She sat in the driver's seat, keys in her lap, staring through the windshield at the concrete wall of the parking structure. The engine stayed silent. Minutes ticked by on the dashboard clock. 12:01, 12:02, 12:03. She thought about the building she'd driven past for years, never knowing they belonged to the man who drove that 7-year-old Camry. She thought about the apartment on Peachtree Flat, where Troy was probably making lunch, not knowing whose roof he was living under. Calvin pulled into the visitor parking space at Peachtree Flat early Saturday morning, the pavement still damp from overnight rain. He sat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, looking up at the building he'd owned for 4 years. The morning light caught the restored brick facade, making it glow warm and rich against the pale autumn sky. He'd driven here countless times, always passing by, never stopping. Today was different. Today, he would walk through the front door of his own building for the first time since Adrian had moved in. The lobby was quiet, the weekend stillness broken only by the soft hum of the elevator. As he stepped inside, he noticed his reflection in the polished steel doors. Button-down shirt, pressed khakis, the same kind of outfit he wore to work every day. Nothing special, nothing that announced what he was about to do. The elevator chimed at the 3rd floor. Unit 3B was halfway down the hallway on the left. Calvin had memorized the layout years ago when overseeing renovations, though he'd never imagined this particular walk. His footsteps were quiet on the carpeted hallway as he approached the door. He knocked 3 times, measured and firm. There was movement inside, the sound of a chair pushing back, footsteps approaching. The door opened, and Troy Beaumont stood there in a gray t-shirt and jeans, holding a coffee mug. His face held the slightly annoyed expression of someone who wasn't expecting visitors. "Can I help you?" Troy asked, not recognizing the man at his door. Calvin stood straight, hands at his sides, voice calm and clear. "I'm Calvin Reeves," he said, "Adrian's husband, and the owner of this building." The coffee mug in Troy's hand went perfectly still. His face shifted through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, disbelief, the beginning of understanding. Movement behind Troy caught Calvin's attention. Adrian appeared in the doorway, wearing yoga pants and a loose sweater. She froze when she saw Calvin, her hand going to the door frame as if to steady herself. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tight. "I came to tell you something directly," Calvin said, his tone professional, unhurried. "The building has been sold." Troy found his voice. "What do you mean, sold? You can't just—" "The sale was completed yesterday," Calvin continued, speaking over Troy's objection. "Reeves Capital Holdings, LLC, has transferred ownership to a new management entity. Standard portfolio restructuring." Troy's mortgage broker instincts kicked in. There are tenant protection laws in Georgia. You can't just evict. Calvin let him finish, then spoke with the same measured tone he'd used since arriving. "Your lease converted to month at last renewal. The addendum you both signed when completing the co-tenant paperwork covers this scenario precisely. The new management company has elected not to renew." He paused. "I'd suggest reviewing what you signed." Adrian hadn't moved from her spot behind Troy. Her face had gone pale, her eyes fixed on Calvin as the full weight of the situation settled over her. "You have 60 days, Calvin said. "Patricia will send the formal notice on Monday." Troy started to speak again, but Calvin wasn't there for a debate. He turned his attention to Adrian one final time, his expression neither angry nor triumphant. "I hope you find what you were looking for," he said quietly. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back to the elevator. The doors opened immediately, the building responding to its owner one last time. He stepped inside and pressed the lobby button. As the elevator descended, Calvin thought about all the times he'd driven past this building, checking on it from a distance. He thought about the contractor who'd restored the brick, the electrician who'd upgraded the wiring, the countless small decisions that had turned a distressed property into exactly the kind of place his wife had dreamed of living. The elevator reached the lobby. Calvin walked through the front doors into the morning sunlight. His Camry sat where he'd left it, unremarkable and reliable. He got in, started the engine, and drove away from Property 7 for what might be the last time. Up in Unit 3B, Troy and Adrian stood in their apartment. Not their apartment, not anymore. Surrounded by the sudden silence of the building they'd thought was their stepping stone to something better. The morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the space they had 60 days to leave. 2 weeks after Calvin's visit to Peachtree Flat, Troy Beaumont sat at his desk staring at an official letter from the Georgia Department of Banking and Finance. His hands trembled slightly as he read the notice again. License suspended pending investigation. The fraud complaint had exploded into something much bigger than he'd expected. 2 more former clients had come forward with similar stories, detailed allegations about being steered into predatory loans, complete with documentation of kickbacks from the lending company. The consumer advocacy attorney handling the case had built a meticulous file, every piece of evidence carefully organized and impossible to dismiss. His office phone rang. Troy knew who it was before answering, the brokerage's managing partner. The conversation was brief and clinical. They were terminating his employment immediately to protect the firm from regulatory exposure. His personal items would be packed and sent to his home address. Please, don't return to the office. Troy set down his phone and looked around his home office in the small rental apartment where he and Adrian had moved after leaving Peachtree Flat. The view through the window showed nothing but a cracked parking lot and a dumpster. The walls were thin enough to hear the neighbor's TV through them. Everything felt temporary and cheap compared to the sleek luxury they'd left behind. In the kitchen, Adrian was on the phone with her sister, her voice tight with strain. No, we can't just find another place right now. Troy's situation is complicated. We're figuring things out. A pause. Of course, I'm not asking Mom and Dad for help. I don't need another lecture about my choices. But the lecture came anyway. That evening, Adrienne's phone lit up with her father's number. She almost didn't answer, but something in her, maybe the part that remembered being Daddy's little girl, made her pick up. I'm only going to say this once, her father said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of parental concern and disappointment. You built your whole future on 2 things, contempt for a good man and fantasy about a flashy one. That's not architecture that was ever going to stand, baby girl. Dad, you don't understand, Adrian started. I understand perfectly, he cut in. You thought Calvin was ordinary because he drove an ordinary car and lived in an ordinary house. You thought Troy was special because he talked smooth and promised big. But here's what you missed. Ordinary men don't quietly build million-dollar real estate portfolios. And special men don't need to talk about being special. Adrienne hung up the phone without responding. She stood in the small kitchen, looking at the water-stained ceiling, listening to Troy in the next room making increasingly desperate phone calls to industry contacts who had stopped returning them. 18 months later, Calvin stood in his new kitchen in the West End, jazz playing softly through hidden speakers as he chopped vegetables for Sunday breakfast. Sunlight streamed through the restored craftsman windows of the bungalow, catching the original hardwood floors he'd had refinished when he bought the place. The house was walking distance from 2 of his properties, but that wasn't why he'd chosen it. He'd chosen it because of the wide front porch, the built-in bookshelves, the way the morning light moved through the rooms. He'd chosen it because it felt like home. His phone buzzed, a text from Felicia, the landscape architect he'd been seeing. They were taking things slow, both of them comfortable with the unhurried pace of people who had learned that good things don't need to be rushed. She was asking about dinner later. He smiled as he typed his reply. That afternoon, Calvin visited one of his Fourth Ward properties for a routine inspection. As he walked the ground floor, a tenant stopped him, a woman who'd lived there for 3 years. I just want you to know, she said, I've been renting in Atlanta for 15 years, and this is the best managed building I've ever lived in. Everything always works. Maintenance is instant. The property manager actually listens. It's incredible. Thank you, Calvin said simply. I'll pass that along to management. He didn't mention that he was the owner. He didn't need to. Back in his Camry, Calvin sat for a moment in the parking lot, looking at the building's face. The restored brick glowed in the afternoon sun, the big windows gleamed, the small design details he'd insisted on during renovation caught the light just right. Everything he'd built, piece by piece, while someone who thought she knew him had decided he wasn't worth knowing. He started the car. The next property was waiting. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.